Thank you for thank you for coming. I am delighted to share this person with you that I met through a really good friend of mine who is Jewish, and after several conversations with Elena about another subject, we got on to the question of Israel and Jewishness, and I was absolutely fascinated with her perspective. And then I got her book and started reading it and decided that it would make a really interesting conversation for a lot of us that have read books about the Israeli and Palestinian conflict and are involved with the Palestinians, Christian Palestinians. So she graciously said that she would be willing to do a conversation with us over Zoom. So many of you have read her book, but I asked her if she would just, talk some about herself, her life, her journey, her book. And then there was a list of questions that we compiled, the questions thoughts that y'all had that I forwarded to. So before we start, Elena, I want to introduce one person in the group, Dr. Bill Curley, who's going to wave at you back there. Can you go in your head? She can't see it. Bill is the originator of this. Oh, you can't see me, can you? Bill is the originator of this group here at St. Paul's United Methodist Church that has about 150 members that kind of forced us to open our minds and look at things differently. And so we give him credit for helping us to explore a lot of other things. So let me just actually introduce officially Dr. Elana Sztokman. She told me I could read the first part of her bio here. She is an anthropologist, educator, blogger, podcaster, award-winning author of 7 genre-bending books, and feminist activist dedicated to building a more passionate world. She is a co-host of a podcast called Women Ending War. I think the way our world is right now, and as crazy it is as it is, the fact that she's living through it and living through it in Israel is just amazing. So, Elena, I'll call you Elena. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you for inviting me. It's really been a real privilege. It was really great chatting with you, and I love the vision of your church. Being open-minded and just being there to listen and witness and all of that. Such beautiful values, and what an honor to be here in this space. Yeah. So did you want to ask me questions first, or you want me to tell you a little bit about myself?
Why don't you talk a little bit about yourself and your journey? And
okay. Sure. Okay. So I'm originally from New York, from Brooklyn, New York. I grew up Orthodox Jewish, very Zionist, religious Zionist, very into Israel. I studied Zionism in school, and then I went to Barnard. And when I graduated, I got married right away to also a nice religious boy. We're still married 35 years later. We have 4 children and 5 grandchildren, one on the way. And then we quickly moved to Israel when we were 23 years old, young parents, because we believed in it. We believed in contributing to the Jewish nation, to the Jewish community. We believed in building a better future. You know, my father grew up with a lot of anti-Semitism. He grew up in the generation where they had signs on the doors saying, no dogs or Jews allowed, and that kind of thing, and quotas where they weren't allowed to be a certain number of Jews in university. He grew up with all of that. And the existence of the state of Israel was very transformative for him. He talks a lot about how the day in 1967, when Israel suddenly won this war and suddenly there was a Jewish nation with strength and power, he stood there in Times Square in Manhattan looking at the news, and he felt a certain Jewish pride for the first time in his life. It was the first time that he felt that he would be able to walk down the street with his skull cap showing, and he didn't have to feel afraid of, being beaten up. He talks about how, he and his brothers used to get beaten up a lot when they were kids. And this whole thing about having a Jewish state changed things for him. So that's what I was brought up into this idea of, Jewishness and proud Jewishness and how vital the state of Israel. And I bought into it, hook, line, and sinker. I did my first degree in education and political science, got a high school social studies teaching certificate, did my second degree in Jewish education, wanted to be a Jewish educator, spent a lot of time being a Jewish educator, wanting to share my love of Judaism with the world. And I did that for a long time. And slowly, I started to sort of peel back certain layers of things that didn't quite mesh reality, what I was sort of socialized into and the reality. Before we even talk about the Israel thing, my first major, let's call it some kind of rebellion, if you will, even though I wasn't a teenager, I was an adult, was about gender. It was about feminism. It was about the role of women in Judaism. And, I spent a lot of years, because my house was growing up was very, very traditional. I'm one of 4 daughters, and we grew up very much with the idea that, women are supposed to be homemakers and good mothers first. And, we're supposed to serve the family, serve our husband, serve the collective. And I sort of bought into that for a long time until that didn't work for me. And I spent a lot of years discovering feminism, being very active in Orthodox feminism, religious feminism, wanting to fix the system from within. And I spent about 15 years doing that. And that's what I did my doctorate in at Hebrew University. I studied gender and anthropology and education. And during those years, I didn't really question anything having to do with the Zionist narrative, because I don't think I had the bandwidth for it, to be honest. I was also raising my kids, and I was trying to unpack things one bit at a time. And I was trying to build community. I was trying to build my synagogue. I was trying to get the synagogue life to be like open-minded and accepting, and, accepting of women. In Orthodox, I don't know how much you know about Orthodox Judaism, but it's not a place that's particularly friendly to women. Women aren't allowed to lead services. They're not allowed to sing in public. The voices are considered sinful. We don't count in a quorum. There's a gender partition in the middle of the sanctuary. So, I spent a lot of years like fighting that and trying to make my home feel good to me as a woman. And so I couldn't do that at the same time that I was also like unpacking all of the Zionist narratives. But at a certain point, around 2006, 2007, I had a couple of experiences that started to challenge certain things. The first experience that I had was I got a job as a writer. I was a writer. I've been a writer, I've been a writer and a teacher pretty much my whole life. I began writing in the late 90s. And so a lot of my sort of day jobs were writing jobs. And so I got this job as a copywriter, content writer for an organization that does what's so-called media, media monitoring. And so I got this job, and I got the following assignment. Every time Palestinians were mentioned, anytime there was an article about Palestinians or by Palestinians or Palestinians were speaking, my job was very simple. I had to prove that they were lying. That was the assignment. If a Palestinian is speaking, my job is to discredit them entirely. Completely discredit. There was no context. There was no reason for the discrediting. There was no like trying to actually find the truth. It was our job is to discredit Palestinian voices. And so I did that for a little bit. And at a certain point, I showed up to the staff meeting and I said, why can't we let Palestinians have their life stories? Why can't Palestinians share their narratives? And the whole table was like deer in headlights. They were all sort of like looking at me like, who is this person and why would you say such a thing? Anyway, the next day I was fired, which was, a blessing in disguise, I could say now, nearly 20 years later, because it sort of freed me. Getting fired freed me to think for myself. I didn't owe anybody anything other than myself. And also, it was the first time ever that I really spoke back to that. It was the first time that I was like in the center of that work, in the center of that dynamic. and seeing it that close up. Even though I had learned this stuff from the time I was in high school. When I was in high school, we had classes in Zionism. My ninth grade class in Zionism was a class where we were taught all kinds of what we would call today talking points. It was a class of training in talking points. It was like a combination of like a TED talk and a marketing sales seminar. The teacher was this really young guy. He was probably, I don't know, 25 or 26 years old and, very cute. And then, he was really cute. He had like really cute hair and a fancy dress around. He didn't care about things like, homework or taking attendance. He used to sit there at the front, with his Argyle socks and eating his pizza. And we all said he thought he was, the greatest thing since, sliced bread. And he would just be there, telling us things like, when Palestinians say X, they're lying. And we're like, oh, okay. I mean, I think of myself, I'm trying to be kind to myself, as sort of like a dumb 14-year-old. But, I feel like teenagers don't necessarily have tools to push back against charisma, especially a charisma that is very intentional. It was very, very intentional to train us to say certain things when we hear certain things. That, for instance, we learned about something called Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin was a terrible massacre that the Jewish state carried out against a village, Palestinian village near Jerusalem called Deir Yassin, in which 100 and something people were killed. Not militants. They were not a militant group. I say we, as a Jew, as an Israeli today, we killed a lot of innocent people there. And so, but what did we know when we were 14? Most of us had never been to Israel. Most of us had never heard what Deir Yassin is. But we had a whole lecture about how when Palestinians talk about Deir Yassin, they're lying. That was the class. And so, when I got to this place where I realized that my purpose in life is to prove that Palestinians are lying, I thought to myself, if this is our best argument for why we deserve to be here, that's not good. That's not a good sign. We need to do better than that if we want to be able to justify our existence here, our presence. Our presence can't be, oh, the whole world is lying. That just doesn't work. And that started me on a journey. That event there of getting fired from that job, which, getting fired isn't pleasant ever. And not only was it so unpleasant, but it was one of these moments when you sort of feel like, am I the crazy one here? Like if everyone else in the room is thinking one thing and you're the only one who's suggesting something else, you really spend a lot of time with yourself and then you get fired for it. You kind of spend time with yourself, like in that wondering place, like, is it me? Is it me? Is it them? I'm not sure, So I started a journey, really a study tour of my own, a listening tour, people might call it. I spent a lot of time because I realized I don't think I knew any Palestinians. I don't think I ever had any real conversation with any Palestinian in my whole life. In the, how many is 25 years that I had been living in Israel, to not have a single Palestinian friend. And then when I think back at this today, that when we were 14, we were able to be the experts on what Palestinians are. I mean, we learned things like Palestinians don't exist. The Palestinian state doesn't exist. They're all making it up. We learned all these kinds of things, and we all just sort of accepted it without ever having met a Palestinian or even read a memoir or a poem. None of that. And so, I finally got to this point where I thought, this is wrong. This is just wrong. And what I really wanted to do was I really wanted to talk to Palestinians. I wanted to talk to them and more listen. I really wanted to hear what Palestinians are saying before I go into that room where everybody says they're lying. And so I did that. I started to connect with all kinds of different organizations that do things like run tours of East Jerusalem or create dialogue groups. I joined a few dialogue groups. There's lots of beautiful organizations doing all kinds of dialogue. There's an organization called Sulha. Sulha means reconciliation. Sulha means like, lisloach means to forgive. And so Sulha is this like coming together. So, and they have all kinds of really cool things like meditation circles and drumming circles. I once went to this like, round meditation, drumming, music, yoga thing. I did weekends. I once took my daughter, who was young, she was probably like 10 or 11. I took her to a women's dialogue group for like a 5-day weekend out in the desert. It was in a place called Eco Me. We were totally off the grid, and it was a mother-daughter thing. And my daughter became really good friends with this Palestinian girl named Sausan, which means rose, Shoshana in Hebrew, and Sausan in Arabic. They became friends. So my daughter had our Palestinian friends before I did, really. So I started doing a lot of those things. I studied NVC, nonviolent communication. I went on tours of East Jerusalem. I met with a family in Walaje, which is near Bethlehem, where the wall was built right around their house, so they could no longer get to their olive trees, and the Israeli government constantly demolished their homes. We hear in the Israeli media, we hear about the demolitions of homes, and we always hear, oh well, clearly they're terrorists, and it's like, these aren't terrorists. They're people who would like to just live on their ancestral land next to their olive groves. And so I did all that. I went on tours of Mount Scopus, where you were able to literally see what's called the apartheid road. You see these two roads, and you see one that is just for Arabs, it's just for Palestinians. Palestinians are not allowed on the other road. And then, you hear people saying, oh, there's no such thing as apartheid. How could you say there's apartheid in Israel? Israeli Arabs vote, they serve in the Knesset, they work in hospitals. But then you look at this reality of these two roads, and it's like, it exists. So I did this. I started doing this for a while, and to really try to, unpack this. And it was hard. It's hard because it's really hard to confront yourself. It's really hard to confront something that you thought was real, and you thought was true, and you thought was important, and you thought was meaningful. I dedicated my whole life. I dedicated my whole life to the Zionist enterprise, to the idea of Jewish nationalism and the Jewish need for sovereignty, and to sort of discover how much of that is built on some really terrible things. I don't reject the idea entirely. I do believe in, Jews should have a place or something, but to confront your own history and to confront the role of yourself and your own people in some really terrible things, that's not so easy. But I did it anyway, and I kept at it because, truth at a certain point, has when the truth sort of knocks on your soul, it has a very persistent impact. It's hard to turn away from that. And so I just kept at it. The first time I ever really spoke publicly, meaning like on social media, let's say, that I sort of began to speak out was in 2014. In 2014, there was yet another war in Gaza, not as bad as this one, but still bad. And we didn't even know there was going to be a war in Gaza. We woke up one day in August 2014, and the headline said, 74 Gazans were killed yesterday, killed overnight. And I was like, what? Just like that, like you wake up in the morning and you discover that our army, okay, where we all serve in, my family also, I didn't serve in the army, but my husband did, my kids all did, their plus ones all did, because it's a people's army, right? There's mandatory conscription in Israel. So the army is everyone, it's not some like random professional, it's our army, it's us doing it. We just killed, 70 something people. And I couldn't wrap my head around this. And so I had never commented on things like this before in social media and stuff. But this morning I said, oh my God, we killed 70 something people. And I wrote, there has to be a better way. That's a lot of ruined lives. I said, that's a lot of ruined lives. There has to be a better way. I didn't even know the specifics of what happened. I didn't know the specific context. All I knew was that this is not it. Whatever problem might have arisen, this thing of we just go in and now 70 something people are dead, that's not it. Anyway, I got a lot of pushback from that. The worst pushback, of course, was the people that I went to school with. I had a lot of friends from school, saying some really terrible things about me. To this day, actually, it's okay. And so that really set me on like a new a new chapter of the journey, which is sort of like saying these things out loud and discovering how deeply entrenched some of these ideas are. And so that went on for a while. It was never my career. It was never my main occupation. My main occupation continued to be education, community, feminism, especially women's rights, women's empowerment. Those were like my grand passions. This was just something that I sort of threw out there. But the reactions really also started to affect me, and that's when I started to really delve into my own education and how what we were educated into and what does that mean for us. Anyway, all of this came to a head on October 7th, 2023. I had had a group also. I was running a women's dialogue group also, a Palestinian Jewish dialogue group of women, all kinds of things. And then October 7th happened. It was an absolutely horrific day. It was one of the worst days in my life. We woke up 6:30 in the morning to bombs, rockets, to news of terror attacks. I had two of my daughters at the time were living in that area. Both had to escape from rocket fire and terrorists and lots of really terrible things. By the end of the day, my two sons-in-law and my son were called up to reserve duty. My son was there for about 3 months. Another son-in-law was there for altogether about 300 days, maybe more. And my other son-in-law was there for probably the whole 2 years, give or take. And my youngest, I have 4 kids. My youngest was still in her regular duty. She was 20 at the time, almost 20. And so she was still in her duty. We didn't see her for a long time after that. We couldn't even could barely even talk to her. Olin we could barely talk to. It was a really terrible experience. There were 1,200 or 1,300 Israelis who were killed. There were 250 Israeli hostages taken captive, which was a brand new thing, which including children and including elderly and including Holocaust survivors. I mean, it was an event unimaginable. Right? It was just unimaginable. And so, all of Israel went into this fighter mode, which you can understand. Everybody was suddenly in oh my God, we're under this massive, massive attack. But then something quickly changed, very quickly, shortly after that. We went from being victims to being, not just defending ourselves, but going on the attack. And I knew that would happen because that's exactly the fight that I was having on social media in 2014 and ever since then, where you're trying to say, why is our response to everything violence? Why do we respond to anything that happens ever with massive amounts of artillery? Artillery is the answer to everything. Shooting, snipers, rockets, tanks, whatever, Air Force. We just bomb and bomb. Why? And what are we doing? And then, over time, this story, this was just getting worse and worse. We're killing babies. We're starving babies. We're destroying buildings. You see a bomb go off and an entire building is destroyed, an entire neighborhood is destroyed. It was very hard to say those things out loud in Israel. The Israeli media doesn't cover those things. The Israeli media will never show what exactly we're doing. It will never show the other side. Never. It just doesn't. And if by chance, it's, oh yes, a Palestinian died, it will never be a Palestinian was killed. It will always be labeled a terrorist, Palestinian terrorist. So those of us, I'm not the only one in Israel who cares about this, obviously. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who at a certain point in the war started protesting this. It took a while. It took probably 8-9 months of war before mass anti-war protests started showing up in the streets. So I feel really grateful that movement exists. But wow, is it hard? Wow, is it hard? Just, to be speaking these things out loud. Because, you get labeled, you get called a lot of names. I used to stand on my street corner with a sign, calling for the end of war and stuff. And I got cars passing by, cursing me all the time. I had some guy throw beer on me. I had people like taking pictures of me, and it's really hard. And the thing that I was particularly keen on, because of my background as a writer, because I am a researcher, I'm an anthropologist, writer. Those are like my tools. That's what I did in my doctorate and my postdoctorate. I analyzed language, and so I started using those tools to try to understand not only the physical war, but the language war. Because suddenly you're realizing that in order for someone to be carrying out all of this violence, they need to be able to justify it. And in order to be able to not only justify it, but to recruit everyday people like citizens and to be able to convince them to do this, first there has to come a language of justifying it. And I started to notice all those things that were happening about language. And one thing really struck me as both odd and alarming was how much the language being used to justify this war was exactly the language that I learned when I was in ninth grade, 14 years old, in Yeshiva Flatbush in Brooklyn. It was the same stuff. It was the same, oh, Palestinians are all lying. Oh, they're all terrorists. I would get into arguments with people on social media, where they would be like, we talking about babies. We're killing babies. And, oh, they're going to grow up to be terrorists. And I'm like, what? What? How can you say it's okay to kill 10,000 babies by saying they're terrorists? What is that? And I'm realizing this comes straight out of my education, straight out of the indoctrination. Do you know when I was in high school, Bibi Netanyahu at the time was the Israeli ambassador to the UN, and he was, eloquent. He was this like young, good-looking, charismatic, great speaker. He had the best words. He was really just, and he would say the same things that my Zionism teacher would say. It would be like all the same, and we thought it was like the coolest thing ever. And suddenly it's like occurring to me that Bibi Netanyahu has been at this for 50 years. For 50 years, he's been training the Israelis and supporters of Israel in spin, in talking points. I mean, he does the same thing to Israelis, what Trump does to his base. I'm sorry if there are Trump supporters among you. I don't mean to like hurt anybody's feelings. But like, this is what Trump does. Trump says lies, he makes things up out of nothing, and then suddenly you have millions of people saying the exact same thing, and it's training. It's this like indoctrination into spin. And I'm realizing Bibi Netanyahu has been doing this my entire life. And everybody, not everybody, but like my community of religious Zionists are all like picking it up and just repeating it and repeating it. Anyway, so that's why I wrote this book. This book has two parts to it. One last sentence and then I'll stop. Is that okay, Lynn? I'm going to last sentence and finish. Okay. So that's what this book is about. This book is two things. This book, what I really wanted to do with this book is analyze language of social media. And I did. The bulk of the middle section of the book is an analysis of social media and the messages, the spin. It's a way that, it's an analysis of the messages of social media, what they're trying to say, how they dismiss and disregard Palestinians and delegitimize Palestinians and delegitimize Palestinian history, and all of that for the sake of justifying terrible violence. But before I did that, I decided also to tell my story a little bit. And I wanted to do that for a couple of reasons. One is to understand that I'm not just like randomly talking about something that I know nothing about. I'm talking about something that I've lived for 50 years. I'm living in this, and I had to unpack it myself, not just with my anthropologist hat, but also with my like human being hat, with my heart and soul, and to open up my heart to touch another person instead of treating them like just, a caricature on a piece of paper. So that's why I decided to tell my story, so that we can understand that people can do this. People can unpack their indoctrination. They can get over all of that hatred that they were taught to believe in and learn to see others as human beings. It can happen. So I wanted to open with that. So the book has those two aspects to it. First, I open with my story, and then I do the anthropological linguistic analysis. And at the end, I talk about what I've been doing during this war, which is lots and lots of peace work, endless dialogue, endless dialogue, and women, especially women's groups, coming together to say there has to be another way. You know, a lot of times people say to me, like, what? So what do you propose? When I say that this is not, we shouldn't be killing babies, for example, among other things, you know, some people will be like, well, what else? Like, what do you expect us to do? Don't you know what happened on October 7th? And it's like, first of all, I know what happened on October 7th. I was there. And second of all, if your only answer to your problem is kill lots of babies, there's something wrong with your thinking. Whatever it is, that is not the answer. So the answer to your question about what else can we do, the answer is anything but this. Anything but this. And so I've been spending since October 7th, since this war, spending like inordinate amounts of time working with my Palestinian partners and Israeli partners and protesters and activists to push the idea that this is not the way. This is not the way. To believe in shared society, to believe in nonviolence, to believe that every human being here deserves to be here, to stop talking about demographics and, you know, who's the majority and all of that. Just accept all human beings here can be here. And we all need the same things. We need the same basic human rights. We deserve the same basic human rights. We all deserve safety, security. We all deserve the ability to thrive and to just live. That's it. Yeah. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. I know we sent you a list of questions, but actually, why don't we just open it up and let people ask the questions you want to ask her now that you've listened to her? You're going to send her to chat.
Well, let me start off with it because I'm married to her. So
Oh,
Okay.
I have to do what she tells me, but I'm doing this of my own volition. So the change in your direction and your outlook on your past education, religious ties, and roots must have caused a bit of a ruckus in your family when you reoriented.
yes. 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 Thank God my husband is still around and he still loves me. And so we thank God every day for little miracles. And he even listens to my podcast. So, wow. So with my kids, it's a little bit more complicated, but I would rather not really talk about my kids so much because they're all adults and they're all, you know, they are who they are and we all love each other, and supporting my kids as they are is the most important thing, you know. So that comes first. My family of origin is a whole other thing, which also I don't really want to get into in particular, but I will just say that beyond like the particulars of the family, you know, it's been really hard with my community, the community that I come from. You know, I'll give you like one story, which is, you know, about a day or two after the war started on October 7th, I got added to an alumni group. There was an alumni WhatsApp group. And on that group, our Zionism teacher was like running the group and he was sharing all kinds of material, like really racist material about how, like, you know, just raise Gaza, just kill them all. Like there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that. I'm like embarrassed to say it out loud, but there's a lot of that. Okay. And so my Zionism teacher was sharing all kinds of like radical right-wing stuff. And, you know, I wrote on the post, I was like, you realize that there are human beings in Gaza, human beings. So the moderator of the group, who was a woman I've known since, you know, fourth grade, we used to be really, you know, good friends. You know, we started messaging privately and she said, we're all worried, really worried about you. She said, don't you know what happened on October 7th? I mean, she's sitting there in Brooklyn. You know, she's sitting there in Brooklyn asking me if I know what happened on October 7th, as if like, I don't get it. You clearly don't understand, is what she said to me. Like, don't you understand? And I said, I lived through it. My kids lived through it. My grandkids lived through it. you know, and, but I'm saying that Palestinians are human beings too. And so she said, clearly you're not well. Why don't you go back to being a grandmother and leave the politics to us? That's what she said to me. And so, first of all, I left that group, because like I couldn't cope with it. I was like coping with war and also two displaced daughters with husbands in the army. I had two single mothers, my daughters living with me, one of whom was pregnant. Also my daughter-in-law was pregnant. She was living with me. She was up north. So it was while my son was, away for a couple of months. And I'm dealing with all that. And I couldn't also be dealing with like the idea that I'm mentally unwell because I dare to think that Palestinians are human beings. So I left the group, but it was really painful. It was really painful to be so easily dismissed as like, an old, demented grandmother in one fell swoop, just like that. It was really difficult. It still is difficult. Some of my some of my some of my biggest haters are from elementary school. There's another guy, his he lives in the settlements. He lives like in a far off settlement. We also were really good friends. Like in third grade, we sat next to each other and we did the spelling bee together and things like that. And he used to refer to me as his radical feminist friend. He used to make posts about me like, yeah, my radical feminist friend thinks that women should be allowed to be rabbis and things like that. And so, he really came down on me. Like he said some really terrible things to me. So I actually blocked him. And then he wrote to me, right? And he said, I talk to my daughter about you before she goes to sleep. I tell her about some of the things she says. And my daughter said to me, why would you be friends with someone like that? And, he's like using me as like target practice. You know what I mean? And I was just like, that's just too much for me to like comprehend. That entire exchange was too much for me to comprehend. About a year later, on Yom Kippur Eve, he wrote to me again and apologized. Yom Kippur is the day of atonement, and people are supposed to rectify relationships and apologize and stuff. And he sent me an apology on Yom Kippur Eve, a year or two later. I think he was sincere. He said, I think I was a little mean to you. And I said, okay, thank you. So these things are like, it's 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 indescribable, to tell you the truth. I don't know why people are so attached to this narrative of that we should be allowed to like kill as many Palestinians as we need to or want to, why that is such a deep part of identity. But again, it comes down to indoctrination. It's because it's so linked to like, oh, we Jews, we Jews are the victims, Holocaust and all of that, and the anti-Semitism my father experienced. And so the antidote is this. And so if we don't do this, then Jews are going to become extinct. And it's like, just take a minute to break that down, that thread of thought so that you realize like there are so many holes in that. And also, who are we? Who are we if we're the people who have turned to become the killers? Who are we? So it's very hard. I'm sorry, that was a really long answer to your question. Yeah.
I have a question about the land, because one of the irrational things that's driving Christian fundamentalism with its irrational connection to Israel has to do with the theological claim that land was given to Jews, and that's part of what's going on in Lebanon today. So what do you say about that business about the Jews being given the land and the need to reclaim it? And of course, Christian idiots think that's when Jesus will come back. And
Right. So assuming that's true, let's just take for a second that it's true that 3,000 years ago, God appeared to Abraham and made Abraham this promise. Okay. Let's say that's true. Who the heck knows? But okay, let's say it's true. Are we really making policy now about something that happened 3,000 years ago? Really? That's written in the Bible. That, first of all, is not policy. That's not, and also, theology does not determine real life in that sense, in the sense of like, oh, well, something, what is in the Bible that really should determine our behavior? Things like love your neighbor as yourself. You know, if only we took that seriously. If only we took seriously the idea that, like, oh, our neighbors in Gaza, maybe we should treat them the way we want to be treated. How's that for biblical? You know, so it's really twisted. That whole thing about, like, oh, well, God wrote, you know, said to Abraham in the Bible 3,000 years ago, and therefore we can go and kick all these Palestinians out of their ancestral homes. It's like, where's the rational thought? Where's like, and where's the humanity? You know, I actually had a bit of a crisis about this last week. I wrote a Substack about this, not last, like 2 weeks ago, because we just celebrated Passover, right? And you know, we celebrated Passover with rockets going off overhead. We spent like an hour before we were supposed to have Seder, we were in the safe room hunkering down because Iran was throwing rockets at us. And my kids didn't want to come over because they didn't want to go traveling on the roads when there were rockets and things. And so our Seder was really not much of a Seder. You know, I don't know if you know about Seder, like it's usually this big thing. You have like 15 people, 20 people. It lasts like 3 or 4 hours. You got lots of special foods and songs, and you read from the book and all this stuff. It's like a really big deal. This year it was me and my husband with like about an hour trying to like get through some things. My daughter, who's in reserve duty, came for a little bit and then left because she had to get back to her post. And then we didn't really do Seder, right? We just didn't do it because. And so before Seder, I knew it was going to happen, that we weren't going to have a holiday. And I thought, like, I don't really care. I just don't care, because why would I bother talking about something that happened 3,000 years ago? The Seder is all about, you know, we were slaves in Egypt and then God took us out and all of that. It's a lovely, fun thing, a story to talk about. And you talk about slavery and you talk about lots of issues and stuff, but mostly it's to remember. It's about remembrance, about something that happened 3,000 years ago. And I really felt like, who cares? Who cares? If we were slaves 3,000 years ago, can we talk about what's happening right now? Like right now, we really need to be talking about what's happening right now. And if we're so obsessed with our history, whether it's the promise of the land or the Exodus or whatever it is, if we're so obsessed with our history that we think that it can justify killing 10,000 babies, we're doing something really wrong. And I want to say, let's not try remembering so much. Let's try remembering less. We need to try remembering less and to care less about the memory and the history in order for us to be able to be fully awake and aware in the present, because the present desperately needs our attention. The present needs our attention more than our great ancestors back there. That's where I am. I can't deal with this anymore. You know, and I say this as, you know, I grew up totally Orthodox, totally religious. I was just, you know, drenched in all of this my whole life. I dedicated my career to being the Jewish educator, teaching all of these things, you know, teaching Jewish history and Jewish connection. And today I'm like, give it up. Give it up. We need to talk about what's happening now. That's where I am. Sorry.
And hearing you, I'm getting more ideas, but there seems to be this all or nothing attitude, especially since the Holocaust. The Jews have been victims of pogroms throughout history and dispersed throughout the world, and now they have their own place and they have to protect it at all costs, because if they're going to be destroyed again. So there is that. But my question was, what do you think of Netanyahu, Bibi, as compared to Donald Trump?
So, okay, I don't know all of you. Like, I don't know what your political leanings are. So if I say the truthful answer and some of you like get offended, if I offend you, okay. Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu are cut of the same cloth. They are almost identical. They are both narcissistic, bloodthirsty megalomaniacs who care only about themselves and their seat of power and do not care about human life. Period. Both of them. I mean, and they use the same tactics. My next book, which hopefully is going to come out in about 6 months, is called Toxic Tactics. And it is about Trump and Netanyahu and tactics of emotional verbal abuse and manipulation, patterns of speech. A little bit about what this book did, right? This book that, that we're talking about now has like a little bit of that. I did an analysis of some of these tactics, the manipulation, the spin that Netanyahu used, that he trained an entire generation or 2 generations in how to use. So my next book is called Toxic Tactics, and it's much more about Trump. But not just Trump, and there are a lot of examples also of Netanyahu, but it's about all of this. It's all about this verbal and emotional manipulation, the lying, the spinning, the bullying, the hatred, the silencing tactics. I mean, these are tactics. These are tactics that narcissistic abusers use against their intimate partners all the time, and against, it's what charismatic abusers use. A previous book that I wrote is called When Rabbis Had Abused, and it was about rabbis and leaders and communal leaders, also priests, for example, who use their authority and power to groom their victims, right? So what I discovered during this war was how much overlap there is between the verbal and emotional tactics of manipulation used by Trump and Netanyahu, how similar those are to the tactics of abuse used by narcissistic abusers. It's all the same. We are all in an abusive relationship with our leadership. We are all living through this abusive relationship en masse because we're being lied to nonstop, lied to and emotionally manipulated in order to do terrible things. The entire populace was emotionally manipulated to get into this war with Iran just now. Like massive lies and gaslighting on such a scale. Anyway, that's the subject of my next book. And the premise of it is that Netanyahu and Trump are pretty much the same. How do you feel about that answer? I hope I didn't offend anybody.
I have a follow-up question. So the good news is that Trump's disapproval rate here is about 60% now. How much of the Israeli people disapprove of Netanyahu? What would you say?
Not enough. Absolutely not enough.
40?
I mean, look, it's hard to know, but the bottom line is that if elections were held today, there's a good chance Netanyahu would win.
Say that again.
If the elections were held today, there is a good chance Netanyahu would win.
Wow.
And also, this war is great for Netanyahu's ratings because it sends Israelis into Israelis are terrified. I mean, we are literally sitting here. And today's our first day without a rocket fire in 6 weeks. And so, you're sitting here being attacked by these rockets. And, you want to say to your leader, okay, do whatever you have to do. We don't care about anything else. We don't care about democracy, human rights. We can't bother being, thinking about who's dying. We don't care about innocent people dying. Forget about all this. Just stop the rockets. And, Netanyahu that's his superpower, is turning himself into the great, I will protect everybody. It's like, Trump's like, only I can save you, or whatever. How do you say it? Only I can fix this. Only I can fix this. Netanyahu does the same thing, only I can fix it. And unfortunately, there are a lot of people who really buy into that. They're terrified and they buy into it. And it's like, all right, we don't care about his record. We don't care about, that he's on corruption trials. We don't care that, people are dying. It's like, you do whatever you have to do. We're going to, we're going to elect the guy who's the toughest. So these wars are great for him. These wars are great for his popularity. It's terrifying, but that's the truth.
She can't see.
Yeah, she can't see you.
Hi, I'm curious about connections between Israel and the US. What does Israeli media say about the US? You spoke about support groups that helped you connect. Are there groups in Israel who are connecting with Americans to share your perspective?
There are, look, I don't know what your name is, with the blue shirt in the back. You talked about that there's like a black and white thing in America, right? Among Jews, sorry, not America, among Jews, it's like black and white, right? There are two, I would say like this. I would say there are two competing views among American Jews, right? Among Jews in general, especially when it comes to the Holocaust and when it comes to fear and when it comes to Zionism. One view is we are victims. We have to protect ourselves. You know, your own people first. The rest of the world doesn't matter. We're not going to let another Holocaust happen. The message from the Holocaust is the world hates us. There's anti-Semitism everywhere, and we do whatever it takes to make sure there's no more anti-Semitism. So in that group, and that's the Netanyahu supporters, in that group, the more America or any other country, threatens Israel with isolation, the more, The Hague puts Israelis on trial, the more defiant they get. It's like, you see, the world just hates us, so do whatever you have to do. So that's what Bibi lives on, right? So Bibi and a whole group of American Jews live on that. However, there is a whole other group of American Jews, and actually in America, it's actually the majority of Jews at the moment, who are like, no. Our job from our lessons from the Holocaust are not the world hates Jews. The lessons from the Holocaust are that hatred is dangerous and it can happen to anyone. And our job is to make sure that it doesn't happen to anyone, right? Our job is to make sure that genocide never happens again anywhere. And especially we should not be the perpetrators. And so there's a whole world of people really dedicated to that idea. And there are groups of American Jews. There are anti-Zionist groups of American Jews, or like liberal Zionists and progressive Zionists, different variations of that theme. But lots and lots of American Jews don't support Netanyahu at all, at all. And so right now, I would say those two groups are sort of in competition for attention from their political leaders. And actually, one of the really interesting things that happened this week, I don't know if this came, how much you're following this, but in the Democratic Party, voices on both the left and the right have called for America to stop giving arms to Israel, to stop giving arms. You had AOC saying that, and then you had Rahm Emanuel saying the same thing. They both said the same thing. America needs to stop giving arms to Israel. That's like massive. Okay, that is a massive shift. And, Bibi ought to be terrified of that. He ought to be saying, okay, I need to shift gears or change something in order to, because I'm losing America. I'm losing the Democratic Party. I'm losing American Jews. He should be saying that, but he doesn't. He responds like the narcissist that he is. He doesn't care about human life. And he goes and digs his heels in deeper. And, he goes into the whole fight. You see, that's why you all need me. I'm your hero. Everybody else hates us. The world hates us. And therefore, but Bibi is definitely losing American support. What's going to happen with Israeli public opinion after this war? Who knows? Like, really, who knows? He's not withering away. Bibi is not withering away from all this. But will he lose support? Will another candidate be able to pick up on all that sentiment? Will somebody stand up and say, has anybody noticed that this whole story is falling apart, that Bibi has ruined everything for everyone, everywhere? Is anybody going to stand up and say that and gain support? I don't know. Did that answer your question at all? I think I might have veered a little.
What does the Israeli media say about America? You said it's a propaganda machine, so I'm just curious what their propaganda is.
Again, it's torn between these two perspectives, right? One perspective is like, America is really important to Israel. It's really an important alliance. That's what Yair Lapid says all the time. Yair Lapid is the opposition leader. He talks all the time about how important the relationship between Israel and America is and how much damage Bibi has done to that. And then there's the whole right wing, the Smotriches and the Ben Gvirs who are like, we don't need America. We don't need America. We'll do this ourselves. So it's like split between those two views. And it's anybody's guess who's going to win, which perspective is going to win out here. It's definitely a tension between those two views. It's definitely, and I don't think that most Israelis understand how much in conflict these two views are. the sort of like macho defiance versus a sort of like nuanced understanding of things. Like, I don't know how much Israelis really get that. Certainly the media is the Israeli media does not really question most of what comes out of the government. They sort of question like a little bit, but not enough. Sometimes certain outlets question a little bit, but certainly not enough. So it's hard to know.
So what is the rationale that Netanyahu is giving to Israel about what's going on in Lebanon?
What's the rationale for Lebanon?
Yeah.
So Lebanon is a whole other thing because uh, it's actually crazy making in its own way. The Lebanon is on the one hand like disconnected from the Palestinian issue, right? The Lebanese, they're not Palestinians, and so the war between Israel and Lebanon doesn't really have anything to do with Palestinians. But Hezbollah, is supported by Iran. Hezbollah is Iran's proxy, and Hezbollah sends rockets to northern Israel nonstop, like nonstop. There were, I don't know, 200 rockets to northern Israel in the last 48 hours, something like that. I mean, I can't even keep up. My son lives up north, so it's really quite terrifying to me, to tell you the truth. There are Hezbollah doesn't stop. Okay, so Israeli public opinion often supports an entrance into Lebanon in ways that are a little more direct, right? Because the rockets from Lebanon are more direct and constant. But at the same time, Israel's history with Lebanon is extremely painful. We were there for 20 years. It was like viewed as the Vietnam of Israel. It was viewed as this, never-ending war where like Israeli soldiers were dying all the time. It took women's peace movements years and years of nonstop protest to finally get the Barak government in 2000 to get Israel out of Lebanon. It was a massive fight. On my podcast last year, I interviewed the woman who led that fight, who dedicated her whole life to that fight. We interviewed her as like an example of the power of protest to make, and suddenly here we are back in Lebanon. Not only back in Lebanon, but already, I don't know, something like 20 Israeli soldiers have already been killed in, a week. I don't know, something like that. I might be getting numbers a little wrong, but it's something like that. And this is like, what are we doing back in Lebanon? It's like America going back to Vietnam after all that. What are we doing in Lebanon? At the same time, Lebanon is still shooting rockets. So it's really conflicting. But also another thing is, about a year and a half ago, right, at the end of 2024, Israel attacked Lebanon and killed Nasrallah. And when the Netanyahu government killed Nasrallah, along with, I don't know, 300 other people, a huge amount of people who were around him, Netanyahu announced, okay, Hezbollah is dead. They were all dead. Hezbollah's gone. There's never going to be another rocket. We've solved this problem forever. And it's like, okay, here we are. Hezbollah is not even close to dead. Nothing has changed at all. The rockets keep coming. So what exactly did all of that accomplish? What? But I don't think Israelis have like a long enough memory for all this. It just doesn't feel like, why aren't more Israelis like screaming about this? The only people screaming about this are all the women's peace movements. Actually, all the peace movements, all the protest movements are screaming about this. But it's like, our protest movements, I can't say for sure how effective we are. I mean, sometimes it feels like we're totally powerless. We're just like screaming into the ether. I don't know. It's really, this Lebanon thing is like crazy making. It's just absolutely crazy making. It's just, yeah. If I lose my mind, it'll be because of Lebanon. Actually, other things too. I shouldn't make sense.
And then there's a question over here. You can't say it. There's all people top of the walls.
Okay.
Thank you for talking with us, first of all, but what is the relationship between the newspapers and the Israeli government? Are they controlled by certain groups, or how does what is the dynamic of that for Israel right now?
That's an excellent question. It's a really important question. I mentioned Netanyahu's corruption trials. He's on trial at the moment for four trials of corruption. A lot of them have to do with media ownership. A lot of them have to do with things that Netanyahu did in order to buy off his coverage in certain places. today, his government is very actively trying to close certain media outlets that he considers not loyal enough. Very similar to Trump. I mean, this is exactly the same thing that Trump has been doing. You know, Bezos in the Washington Post. I mean, what isn't Trump trying to buy? CNN. And I mean, this is a tactic of the order, you know, the autocratic leaders. This is what they do. They buy off media. And so Netanyahu is using the exact same tactic. There were a whole bunch of different media outlets that he's been trying to buy off. Some of them he already has. They're already, you know, and also what he does to bribe, you know, journalists to make sure that he gets the coverage that he wants and all of that. So that is a very real thing that has escalated in the current government. And there is a new media, like a union, like an association of journalists that have like stopped everything that they're doing in order to fight for independent media, because independent media is under immediate, urgent threat in this government. It's really happening right in front of our noses. The communication ministry is very actively trying to, rescind licenses from different outlets and things like that. So this is terrifying. This is terrifying.
And I'm mindful of her time. One last question. I guess my last question would be, do you think the women's movements, peace movements, are still there and solid? Has this given them more backbone,
Yes,
or has it
yes,
scared
more
them?
backbone. I can count at least 6 new women's organizations that have started since October 7th. 6 new, at least, if not more, of and many of them are, you know, Israeli-Palestinian partnership organizations. There's an organization called OLMEP, the Alliance for Middle East Peace, that has added, it's an alliance of now over 180 peace organizations, many of which are women's organizations. So women are definitely leading the protest right now. Does that mean that we have power? That I don't know. My big question is, how do people go from grassroots protest to having real power in decision making? That's like a tough nut to crack, and I don't know the answer to that. But I do know for certain that grassroots women's movements are in an upswing, both in numbers and in like the power of the words, right? Like, so for instance, before October 7th, you weren't allowed to really say the word peace out loud. There was this like thought that if you say the word peace, then you're going to be considered not legitimate. You're going to be considered so radical that nobody's going to take you seriously. That has changed. You know, last year, there was first time in about 20 or 25 years, there was a massive conference dedicated to peace. And actually, there's supposed to be another one in April. The second conference is supposed to be now, but because of the war in Iran, like who knows what's going to happen with it. But suddenly it's okay to say peace again. It's also okay to say shared society. Talking about shared society was also, you know, verboten. And now it isn't. And so there's no organization called the Women's Cabinet, which a friend of mine is running, and she's been like going all around the world. And it's, some super interesting things are happening on the grassroots. Absolutely, that's happening. I don't know where it's going to lead. I don't know how to find our power. I don't know how women's groups, how we can find our power. So that's why I do a lot of media. I do a lot of like podcasting, and we're starting more podcasts now. We're opening up a new channel. It's going to be called the Peace Channel. I'll share it with Lynn when we're up. We're like, it's in development at the moment. I really hope it'll be up in the next like month or 6 weeks. Media feels super important to me because it's like the only way we can really find our power. So yeah, I don't know what's going to happen with this, but there are definitely more people like on the grassroots, women especially, you know, just screaming. There were a lot of women's mothers of combat soldiers. I belong to a whole bunch of different groups of mothers of combat soldiers who are like, you got to stop sending our kids to war. You know, that also used to be verboten. It used to be like, you know, parents of soldiers were expected to, you know, line up, report for duty and stay silent. Like that was our job, like not to say anything. It's like you give us your sons, your kids, and then you go home and that's it. But today, parents are not doing that anymore. Women are leading that and saying, you cannot have our kids just to do whatever you want. You got to stop this war. You got to find negotiated settlement solutions, ceasefires, something else, anything but this. The answer is not violence. The answer is negotiated agreements. So lots of women's groups doing that right now.
Thank you, Elena. It's heartbreaking and reassuring to know that there's people like you.
I'm
Thank
not
you.
alone. I belong to a whole community, really great people who are trying to make the change. Thank you for being here. Thank you for inviting me, Lynn.
Yes, thank you. Bye. Okay,
Recorded that.
yes.
I think we ought to have.
Yes, ma'am.